Hi, Tink. Can you hear me?
Hello. Подождите, организатор конференции разрешит вам войти.
Добрий день, шановні учасники. Ми з вами почнемо за 20 хвилин. Дуже вам дякую за те, що ви прийшли трохи завчасно. Можете поки що в чаті писати, звідки ви, і потрошки знайомитися. А ми зараз робимо всі технічні налаштування і почнемо вже за 20 хвилин. Hi, team, can you hear me well? Can you please unmute your audio? Just a second, I will try to do so.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can.
Wonderful.
I'm really happy to see you. How are you?
Really, really well. And you?
Yeah, as well. It was really a busy 3 weeks of our conference. So yeah, really inspired. And today we have a lot of people who register. So I hope that all of them will come online. But if not, they will receive a recording.
Yeah.
And can find this information. So yeah, I propose to check presentation maybe. I know that you did with Dasha all the settings, but maybe let's try to show one more time to be it easier for you to use it during presentation.
Lovely. Okay, so right, we'll get the presentation up.
Yeah, you just open presentation on your laptop.
Yeah, we're coming up now.
Yeah. And you have to choose a slideshow.
Yeah, we're just doing that now.
And from beginning, I think. Yeah, wonderful. It's even Ukrainian version.
Perfect.
So, can you try to open next slide? Just to be sure that it works. Yeah, everything great. You can turn it off. And I also will turn on your video. So when you would like me to turn on your video, you just have to stop your presentation of the screen and just let me know that you would like to show this video.
Yep.
So I will open this on my...
So if I go to the 5th, hold on, 1, 2, 3.
You can just tell me, yeah, you can just tell me that right now you would like to show your video.
Okay, and right now I'm going to show the first video. And this represents a victim in the process of an abusive scenario. While she's verbally communicating with the abuser in the way that he has groomed her to do, her thoughts whilst this is happening and the reality for her and the impact on her well-being is communicated via the wording that appears at each stage of the scenario. So that makes sense. Yes, they understand that the wording is actually her inner thoughts.
Yeah, and maybe, do we have translators with us already? Just a second, we will check if we have translators right now. So, just a second, I will check. Они есть с нами или нет сейчас?
Andrei is here online.
Great. May I ask? I can hear my voice.
Yeah, I can as well.
Yeah. Maybe we can turn off. Can I? No, I can hear myself now. Okay, can you please turn off your audio? And now? Yeah, now great. So my question to translators, we will show video, I will show it now. May I ask you to translate words that we will see on this video because I saw this video before in London. So it will be really useful for participants to... Dasha, I'm not sure that in this format we can show this, because it is in Telegram. Just a second, I will... Мне надо его сохранить? То есть я... Окей, секундочку. А как я его отсюда сохраню на компьютер? Just a second, we will understand how to download this video to computer. Just a second. Video saved, download. Just a second, and we will check to make it available and try to... Да, сейчас давай видео проверим, и после этого проверим перевод. Так. Tink, just give me a few minutes. I will download the video and try to show this to translators so they can translate it. Now it's work. Okay, I will try. Could you please stop your translation? I will. Включи мне, пожалуйста, демонстрацию экрана или переведи меня в соорганизаторы. Организатор отключил демонстрацию экрана участников. Шановні учасники, ми збираємося зараз поки що тестимо всі технічні можливості і налаштування, які нам сьогодні стануть в нагоді. Тому у вас є ще 10 хвилин точно закінчити свої справи і в чаті також написати, звідки ви, щоб ви потрошки могли знайомитися. Translators, could you see this video?
Hey, babe. Come closer.
I cannot hear you. Maybe you can turn on audio. То есть нам нужно не в переводчиков завести сейчас перевод, а помочь, чтобы мы видео протестили, чтобы они могли переводить по ходу. Они еще не зашли? Да, секундочку. Okay, just a second. Just a second, we will add our translators with additional settings so we can see this video together and try if we can make translation during the presentation of the video. So just a few seconds. Шановні учасники, вітаю вас всіх. Поки що робимо всі технічні налаштування. В нас ще 10 хвилин до початку, тому можете поки що підготувати конспекти, чи взяти води з собою, чи кави, і за 10 хвилин ми будемо починати. А поки що в нас технічне налаштування, ви в чаті можете писати, з якого ви міста.
So Anastasia, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the slide before each video needs to be shown. I have made a note to say, can we now see the next video? Okay, and then that will come up and then that will disappear in my presentation. I presume will just come back. Perfect.
Yeah. Oh, I will just, don't worry, I will all the presentation with you. So if something go wrong, for example, we cannot see presentation, I just will let you know. But if anything will happen, we as well have your presentation in Ukrainian, so I just will open it on my laptop and we will go forward, so don't worry.
As ever.
Что? Есть переводчики у нас? Как зовут у нас переводчиков? Ася і Андрій, вітаю вас. Пропоную нам спробувати протестити відео. Чи встигнете ви перекладати на українську мову текст, який буде на відео? Давайте спробуємо. Я зараз відкрию, бо відео в нас англійською мовою, але ж дуже хотілося б, щоб учасники змогли це відео зрозуміти.
I'm here to please you. Thing you want.
Чи є звук? Ні? Зараз. Це мені треба іспанську. Так, тоді я включаю іспанську мову, да? Окей, зараз я тут більше зроблю відео. Не хочу воно більше. Ось так буде. Так, окей, зараз роблю трансляцію. Угу.
Hey, babe. Come closer.
Мені здається, все працює. Я не хочу просто спойлерити, показувати все відео. Окей. Окей. So this video works. It's wonderful, and it will be also possible for us to translate this. And just few seconds, I will download the second one, and we will try the second one. Okay?
Perfect. Perfect.
Я не могу одновременно делать все. Скажи мне, пожалуйста. So just a second. I will now open the second video, and we will test it as well. Okay. Чи вдається тут перекладати? Я вже. Давайте ще раз спробуємо. А відео ви бачите? А так? Нема?
Liked the sound of you. And that was my day. Can I ask you something?
Дивіться, як варіант, я можу вам надіслати зараз це відео, і ви можете передивитися, поки в нас... Да, щоб вам простіше було, бо тут він швидше розмовляє, і я переживаю, що буде важко перекласти просто. В тебе є? В Даші є ваша електронна пошта, і Даша вам ось це друге відео, яке з хлопцем. Вона вам тоді надійшла, просто щоб простіше було перекладати. А третє, це в нас аудіо, да? Що з ним треба зробити? Tink, may I ask you? And Dasha also showed me that we have audio for up to 4 minutes. As I understood, a recording of Survivor. And I just worry if it will be possible to translate it because it's really quickly. So what do you think if we will show this 2 video, but will not show this audio recording, but maybe we could just explain this story? What do you think?
Perfect. No problem with that at all. No problem with that.
We will translate.
So I'll put the main slide up and picture of Mary Collins, yeah, and then I can tell them about her story.
Yeah, it will be wonderful. So we will be able to simultaneously translate the video. So we will see your video, and translator will translate it into Ukrainian simultaneously. But with audio, it will be more difficult. So if it could be possible that you can explain.
No problem.
So I think we checked all settings. And also, I just would like to let you know how you can choose language. You have in the end of your screen globe, or you can see English or translation. It's near the red bottom exit.
Okay, just having a look.
You can see reaction and exit, red bottom exit. So between reaction and exit, you can see language or English or Spanish. And you just have to choose English there.
Okay.
So you just have to choose English. So when we will have opening remark, or when we will have question in Ukrainian, you can hear English version simultaneously.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So you don't have to stop during your presentation because we will have simultaneous translation. So you just hold your presentation in English and don't wait for anybody. I cannot hear you because somebody mute you. Это была не ты? Yeah, now I can.
Now you can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah, so we will not spend any time for waiting for translation. And also we will have all questions in the end. And we have some questions in advance already from people who registered for the event. They filled the form and wrote their questions. So we will start from these questions. And if we will have some additional questions from people who participate today, we also will give them floor to ask their questions.
Perfect. That's fine.
Yeah. I think that's all. We have 2 minutes more to let everybody to join us. And I really wish us a wonderful event today. And I really would like to thank you for joining us today. It's a really big and pleasure for us and honor.
And it's a pleasure for us, and you know that. And we're really looking forward to working in the future.
Thank you. Кто замьютил опять ее? Что ж такое у нас со звуком? Okay, and you are already again muted. Could you please check what happened? No, not. Okay. Okay. Okay, I propose to mute maybe for 2 minutes. And we have 2 minutes more for everybody to join. And then I will just introduce you in 5 or 6 minutes. We will start from like a basic information about how to use platform, how to turn on translation, and then we will have opening remarks, and then will present you, and floor will be yours.
Lovely, lovely, Anastasia.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so see you in 2 minutes.
Yeah, lovely.
Шановні учасники, вітаємо вас. Ми почекаємо 1-2 хвилинки, поки всі доєднаються. Побачимо, що багато людей одночасно приєднуються. Тому за 2 хвилини будемо починати. А ви поки що в чаті можете писати, з якого ви міста, з якої установи, щоб ви потрошки могли знайомитися. Тоді до зустрічі за 2 хвилини. Добрий день, шановні учасники. Вітаю вас з нами сьогодні на заході. Мене звати Дьякова Анастасія, я радник з питань безпечного інтернету для кожної дитини при віце-прем'єр-міністрі, міністра цифрової трансформації, а також засновник освітнього проєкту Stop Sexting. І сьогодні я буду модератором нашого круглого онлайн-столу на тему особливості та процедури надання послуг для дітей та їх сімей, які постраждали від насильства в інтернеті. Це вже наш 7-й заключний захід в рамках міжнародної онлайн-конференції «Діти та інтернет. Відповідь держави» для фахівців системи правоохоронних органів та державного сектору у сфері освіти та соціального захисту населення. Міжнародна онлайн-конференція відбувається за ініціативи уповноваженого президента України з прав дитини Миколи Кулеби в партнерстві з Абаролі, ініціатива Американської асоціації юристів ініціативи з верховенства права та освітнім проєктом Stop Sexting, а також громадською організацією служби порятунку дітей. Трошки вам хочу розповісти про наші правила. Просимо всіх учасників виключити звук, аби не заважати один одному. Якщо ви хочете, ви можете залишати відео чи вимкнути відео, але ж звук, будь ласка, не включайте, бо це дуже-дуже заважає всім нам з вами працювати. Як буде сьогодні строїтися наша робота? Ми почнемо з невеличкого вітального слова. Далі передамо слово нашій колезі із Великої Британії для презентації. Далі в нас буде коротеньке опитування і час для запитань. Деякі з ваших запитань ми вже отримали в ваших реєстраційних формах. Дуже вам дякую, було багато цікавих запитань. Ми почнемо з цих запитань і далі будемо отримувати ваші запитання також в чаті. Тому ви можете відразу в чаті по ходу презентації писати ваші запитання, і ми будемо їх задавати чи давати вам слово для того, щоб ви могли їх озвучити під час виступу нашого партнера. Разом із тим хочу вам розповісти про переклад. Можливо, хтось із вас вже був в Zoom на заходах, де був переклад. Бачите, що наші гості сьогодні з Великої Британії, на жаль, українською вона поки що не розмовляє, але ж ми сподіваємося, що є така надія. Тому вам треба буде обрати внизу в лінійці, де ви бачите різні налаштування, треба обрати чи глобус і там обрати мову іспанську. Або у вас може бути написано англійська чи іспанська мова, це написано внизу, поруч з іконкою реакції, детальніше, або вийти, покинути Zoom-конференцію. Тобто треба обрати такий глобус чи мову, там може бути різні значки, вам треба обирати іспанську мову, бо саме на іспанському каналі відбувається трансляція, переклад на українську мову. Здається, з технічних питань це все. Ви також в кінці отримуєте презентацію. Всі учасники сьогоднішнього заходу отримують презентацію, чи сьогодні ввечері, чи вже завтра. Тому в пошті, будь ласка, в спамі теж дивіться, може вона попасти, на жаль. Я хочу подякувати сьогодні нашому спікеру, нашим учасникам. Насправді, тема соціальних послуг для дітей, які пережили сексуальне насильство в онлайні, достатньо нова для України, тому я дуже радію, що в нас стільки сьогодні небайдужих людей, які хочуть отримати більше інформації з цієї теми. І дуже сподіваюся, що ті матеріали дуже вам стануть в нагоді в роботі з вашими клієнтами, з дітьми і родинами, які постраждали, і також допоможуть швидше тим родинам і дітям проходити реабілітацію та повертатися до звичайного життя. Зараз я хотіла би передати слово представнику нашого партнера на сьогоднішньому заході. Цей захід сьогодні в нас відбувається в партнерстві з Міністерством соціальної політики, тому хочу передати слово Руслану Клубасі, генеральному директору Директорату розвитку соціальних послуг та захисту прав дітей Міністерства соціальної політики. Пане Руслан, скажіть, будь ласка, чи ви мене чуєте?
Добрий день, мене чути?
Так, ми вас і чуємо, і навіть бачимо. Це чудово.
Я радий вітати всіх учасників. Мені дуже приємно і хочу перш за все подякувати про організацію безпосередньо такої наради, такого семінару. Тема, як ви вже сказали, дуже актуальна, нова в деяких питаннях. Можливо, спілкуючись попередньо, проговорюючи ці всі проблемні питання, ми розуміємо, що не на всі зараз виклики ми можемо дати відповіді, але питання безпеки в інтернеті є дуже важливим в тому, що воно дуже активно розвивається. Дуже багато дітей знаходяться в інтернет-мережі, і тут питання відповідальності, розуміння, що відбувається з дитиною в цей період, які загрози можуть бути по відношенню до кожної дитини, для нас дуже важливо знати і як реагувати. Тема, яку ви сьогодні озвучили, це, по суті, робота поліції, соціальних служб, реагування, підтримка. Це все є дуже важливо. І коли ми кажемо, коли є дитина, яка зазнала, наприклад, сексуальне насильство або інші форми насильства в сім'ї, є порядки реагування. Нещодавно, ви знаєте, прийнятий новий порядок про виявлення дітей в складних життєвих обставинах. І тут також розподілені певні ролі кожного суб'єкта, починаючи від виявлення, реагування і окремі кроки кожного із наших колег на місцях. І, по суті, вроді би все зрозуміло, треба виконувати, треба мати людей, треба розуміти. Інша ситуація, коли ми стикаємося з віртуальним світом, коли є дитина, по великому рахунку, яка є в мережі, яка контактує з певними особами, яка також зазнає певних ризиків, загрози і насильства. І як тут реагувати, як виявляти, яким чином запобігти цьому. Як повинні реагувати безпосередньо батьки – це одна ситуація, але як повинні реагувати наші колеги на місцях, поліція, кіберполіція або безпосередньо служба у справах дітей і соціальний працівник. Яку допомогу треба надати безпосередньо дитині, яка постраждала. І один процес, коли ми виявляємо і працює поліція, інший процес пояснити дитині і надати ці послуги. Це дуже важливо. Ми на сьогоднішній день, як міністерство, розробляємо різні закони, постанови. Ви знаєте, до 1 червня було прийнято ряд таких змін і на законодавчому рівні щодо посилення відповідальності, щодо порядку виявлення і про інтернатну систему. Я зараз про це просто не буду казати. Можу сказати тільки одне, що навіть, по суті, такі документи, як Національний план дій з імплементації Конвенції по правах дитини, він також передбачає певні заходи. На мою думку, їх треба збільшувати, цю присутність таких заходів, кількість таких заходів, потужність, ну і, по суті, визначати певні механізми як на центральному рівні взаємодії, так і безпосередньо давати посили на місцях. Тому я в рамках тільки привітального слова хочу всім подякувати організаторам, хочу подякувати всім учасникам за те, що ви не байдужі до цього питання. Я сподіваюся, що сьогодні буде плідна робота. Ми почуємо ряд і відповідей, і досвіду, особливо міжнародного досвіду. Я дякую нашим партнерам, міжнародним партнерам, які сьогодні долучилися безпосередньо. І для нас дуже важливо бачити цей досвід міжнародних країн, міжнародний досвід, оскільки ті чи інші теми ми тільки починаємо кроки по тим чи іншим темам, по-іншому у нас є дуже багато досягнень, але в будь-якому разі, на мою думку, от система, яка вже створена на найкращих прикладах, європейських прикладах наших колег, вона має право застосовуватися в нашій країні. І ми, як, скажімо, суб'єкти, які координують питання захисту дітей, повинні якомога швидше впроваджувати ці форми, запроваджувати цей досвід. Тому я щиро дякую всім учасникам, бажаю плідної роботи, ну і сподіваюся, що ми максимально отримуємо розуміння, що робити, як робити, ну і по великому рахунку, як далі рухатися по цій проблематиці. Щиро дякую, бажаю успіхів в нашій роботі.
Дуже вам дякую, пане Руслан, за таку надихаючу промову. Я теж сподіваюся, що в нас сьогодні буде дуже плідна і корисна для всіх учасників робота. Дуже вам дякую, і далі хочу передати право вітального слова Дмитру Філіпенко, директору Американської асоціації юристів ініціативи з верховенства права або ролі в Україні. Дмитро, ви нас чуєте і бачите?
Бачу, дякую, Анастасії. Шановні друзі, я радий всіх вітати. Дякую величезно за таку можливість співпраці з Міністерством цифрової трансформації, з урядовим, з президентським уповноваженим з прав дитини. Наразі наша організація імплементує програму «Інтернет-свобод в Україні», і ми раді, що в рамках цієї програми ми маємо можливість долучитись до такої корисної ініціативи. керівником якої фактично стала організація Stop Sexting. І дякую, Анастасії, за можливість співпрацювати разом з вами в рамках цієї програми. Ми вже провели, якщо я не помиляюсь, 6 круглих столів з різних тематик. Ми спілкувалися з різними аудиторіями, ми обговорювали різні тематики. В нас були експерти з Америки, з Великобританії, з Іспанії, з багатьох країн світу. І я впевнений, що в умовах, коли ми всі опинились заручниками такої ситуації, коли світ переходить онлайн, найбільшої загрози зазнають саме наші діти, які ще не мають досвіду чи розуміння того, як працювати в онлайн-мережах, на які ризики вони можуть бути наражені. Тому кожен наш круглий стіл – це для мене нове відкриття, і я сподіваюся, що з кожним таким круглим столом наші фахівці і всі ми, як експерти, матимемо більше можливостей поділитися позитивним досвідом, позитивними практиками і отримати щось нове для себе. Так само і сьогодні я дякую нашим спікерам за можливість долучитися до нас з їх досвідом та з промовами, і з нетерпінням чекаю ефективної співпраці сьогодні. Дякую, Анастасії, дякую, шановні учасники.
Дуже вам дякую, Дмитро. Так, насправді в нас вже відбулося 6 круглих столів, і сьогодні в наш заключний круглий стіл. Минулого тижня ми спілкувалися з колегами зі всього світу, мені здається, щодо програм освітніх для поліції, суддів і прокурорів. А тиждень тому ми спілкувалися з колегами з Великої Британії щодо створення консультаційних ліній. І вже в вересні на базі урядового контакт-центру в Україні буде запущена консультаційна лінія 24/7, на яку можуть телефонувати діти, батьки і спеціалісти. Тому учасники сьогодні, які з нами, ви теж можете телефонувати вже з вересня на цю лінію. Сподіваюся, що всередині вересня ми вже її запустимо. В партнерстві з Міністерством соціальної політики ми це все робимо. І також ще один вебінар у нас був присвячений корекційним програмам для злочинців, які скоїли сексуальні злочини проти дітей. У нас відбувається запис кожного вебінару. Ми зараз обговорюємо можливість відкритого доступу всіх учасників до матеріалів, які були створені протягом тих круглих столів. Тому в нас є ваші імейли, і коли така платформа в форматі, в якому ми скоро вирішимо, буде створена, ми вас обов'язково проінформуємо, і ви зможете більшість цих круглих столів також передивитися. Ну, а зараз я хотіла б передати слово нашому шановному спікеру Тінг Палмер. Вона є керівником британської організації Marie Collins Foundation. Про цю організацію, думаю, вона розповість трошечки детальніше, але ж я хотіла б від себе щиро подякувати Тінг за те, що сьогодні ви з нами. Ми з Тінг познайомилися 1,5 роки тому в Лондоні, в британській поліції, і з того моменту ми підтримуємо зв'язок, і робота Тінг мене дуже сильно надихає. І також в організації Marie Collins Foundation цієї осені буде відбуватися конференція. Вона теж буде в онлайн-форматі англійською мовою. Можливо, Тінг, якщо учасники з України можуть приєднатися, ті, хто знають гарну англійську мову, то ви можете декілька слів в кінці також розповісти про конференцію, бо ми сьогодні отримали запрошення на такий захід. Якщо така можливість є, на жаль, українського перекладу там поки що немає, тому будемо переймати ваш досвід сьогодні. І я ще раз нагадую про переклад. Хто ще не зрозумів, як це зробити, внизу біля кнопки «Вихід» ви можете побачити чи глобус, чи іспанська, чи англійська мова. А ярличок такий, вам треба брати іспанську мову, це буде українська. Всі запитання, будь ласка, пишіть в чат, будемо задавати їх в кінці. Ну, а зараз передаю слово Тінг, і дуже щаслива, що ви сьогодні з нами.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I think the most important thing we can stress more than anything is that we must work in partnership together. This is a universal issue. No country can tackle this issue on their own. No discipline can tackle this issue on their own. And the fact that we are working in partnership with you and with other nations and wish to do so in the future, I think is a really concrete and positive approach to the work that we hope to take forward. We're just getting the presentation Sorry about this. We've got a blockage on the Perfect. Okay, well, let's get started. Today, I've been asked to specifically look at the recovery needs of children who are harmed online through sexual abuse and exploitation. And as we know, the interconnections between offline and online are becoming more and more apparent. So what I will not be covering is how we make assessments of risk before recovery takes place or the investigation process, but I will be obviously referring to those throughout the presentation. And the presentation is basically in 4 sections. So for the first 5 slides, it's going to be about an introduction. And then for slides 6 to 16, I'm going to introduce a model for intervention, whether it's sexual abuse offline or online. And I think what we need to bear in mind is that this is an overall look at the model, but it is not detailed, because for detailed consideration, we would need to have working seminars and workshops where we can have interaction and for the training of professionals. What I hope to do is to share with you what we have learned over the years about the key issues of working with young people, what their needs are, and then also we're going to move on to the differential impacts when it is internet abuse involved also in the abuse of children. I then am going to do what I call digging down a bit deeper on 3 particular issues, just to share with you the types of questions we need to be asking ourselves, particularly when helping children recover from the impact of viewing adult pornography and the issues around that, working with children and non-abusing carers when they're in a family where the normally the male member of the family has downloaded abusive imagery, and we'll also look at young people's harmful sexual behaviours online, and particularly our concerns around the criminalisation of young people. So let's move on and just talk a little bit, very briefly, about the Mary Collins Foundation. We were founded in 2011 when we registered as a charity, and we commenced work in 2012. And our vision is that all children and young people who suffer sexual abuse facilitated by the internet or otherwise are supported to recover and live safe and fulfilling lives, free from fear and positive about their future. I first worked with children abused via the internet in 1998, and at that time I was running a large therapeutic unit for children who had been sexually abused, and we also had a discrete program for children with sexually abusive behaviours. And it's at that time that we worked closely with our police colleagues, and they came to me one day and they said, "We have a real problem here. We have an internet case and we've never had one before. What should we do with it?" And we all looked at one another and thought, we have no knowledge, we don't know what to do. 2 days later, we had another discussion and we said, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have a huge knowledge around sexually abusive behaviour and its impacts on children. And we also have good intervention programs when that abuse is offline. So let's hold on to what we know, but what we need to do is look at the differential impacts, whether there are any, and what that is going to mean for future work. And thus my interest in the development of proper programs to intervene to help children recover from online abuse began. I think I'd like to point out our key principle. It is absolutely essential, and this theme will carry on throughout this presentation, that we place the needs of the child victim and their family at the centre of any investigation and also any professional intervention. Because if we do that, if they feel valued, if they feel respected, we are far more likely to be able to help the child tell more about their story and what's happened, and therefore be far more informed when it comes to the policing of the matter and the police investigation. And as we know, whenever we first meet someone, you get the initial impression often that has a lasting impact on you. So therefore we say within the Mary Collins Foundation, and we encourage our colleagues across the piece, that always hold unconditional regard for children and their families, That does not mean to say we don't challenge behaviours that are unacceptable, but as human beings, they receive our unconditional regard, no matter what. And of course, this actually is underlined when it comes to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I picked out two articles, Article 3 and Article 39, because they really constitute what we're talking about today, and you'll see them on the screen. Our definition in the UK that we use, and this is in our practice guidance of safeguarding children, and you'll notice in the definition that there's both offline abuse, online abuse, non-contact sexual abuse, which are all incorporated, and often these are all interconnected. Some that it might be just a one form of abuse, but generally one needs to look at the interconnections which inevitably happen. And as I mentioned earlier, never forget that if you were to get a referral about a child who's been abused offline, you need to look and see what's happening online, and vice versa. If the initial referral is around a child abused online, then do look and see what's been happening on the offline world as well. Now, the next slide I'm going to show is a video, and it represents a victim in the process of an abusive scenario. While she is verbally communicating with the abuser in the way that he will have groomed her to do so, her thoughts whilst this is happening and the reality for her and the impact on her well-being is communicated by the wording that appears at each stage of the scenario. So you will see wording as she is speaking to her abuser. There's words underneath, which is actually her personal thoughts and what she is feeling at that time when she is going through this grooming abusive experience. So if we could have that video, that would be wonderful.
Just a second, I will turn on the video.
If I can just say while the video is being arranged, that all videos that are going to be shown during this presentation and also the quotes during this presentation are all regarding the cases of children that we have worked with over the years and will have their permission to be able to tell their story in order to help others recover.
Одну хвилинку, хочу уточнитися з перекладачами, чи є в нас переклад. Окей, давайте, тоді я ще раз запускаю, бо я не чула від вас переклад, коли почалося відео, а дуже хочу, щоб учасники все ж таки українською мовою могли побачити це відео. Угу. Все, супер, зараз тоді запускаємо ще раз.
Hey, babe. Come closer. I'm here to please you. I'll do anything you want. You make me so horny. Let me give you a thrill to remember. I feel so hot.
Не працює відео, наскільки я зрозуміла, да? У учасників. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи працює відео? І я б дуже попросила, я дуже вибачаюся за цей технічний момент, я б дуже просила перекладачів також перекладати субтитри, бо ми бачимо в аудіо те, що вона каже, і бачимо в субтитрах те, що дівчинка насправді відчуває. І скажіть, будь ласка, перекладачі, чи ви бачите відео, бо наскільки я зрозуміла, воно завісло, ви чули лише звук. Да. Ну, тому якщо у вас не рухається відео, то ви, будь ласка, скажіть, я ще раз запущу. Да, відео не бачите. Ви ж кажіть, бо в мене воно працює. Давайте тоді ще раз. Я вибачаюся, але ж я дуже хочу, щоб всі змогли побачити повністю це відео, бо воно просто насправді шокує. Так, зараз я тоді демонструю ще раз, і ви тоді дайте мені знати, чи будете ви бачити, щоб в нас все працювало.
Hey, babe. Come closer. I'm here to please you. I'll do anything you want. Make me so horny. Let me give you a thrill to remember. I feel so hot. Keep going.
Дуже дякую. І, Тінк, я передаю слово вам. Could you please turn on your presentation again?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. That video we put together with advice from our Young Survivors group, and we have used it in order to assist young men between ages 18 to 25 to be careful about their activities online and to consider what images they may be looking at, particularly when they're going onto adult pornography sites, etc. Just getting back into the presentation. Right, I'm now going to develop and go into a working model for early intervention. And why is early intervention essential? I think probably many of you who are so experienced in working with children and young people will appreciate that if children are left in a state of limbo following the disclosure of a traumatic event in their lives, particularly when it comes to sexual abuse, their low self-esteem, their self-worth, etc., will develop into signs and symptoms of distress, self-harm, or destructive behavior. And I think what is so underestimated is the trauma of disclosure or stroke discovery, depending on which sort of sexual abusive experience we are considering for the child. And what children need, just as adults need when they've been through a trauma, is acknowledgement of their feelings and fears, and they need guidance, and they need this as soon as possible. And we know clinically in our work that the longer the period of time between disclosure and therapeutic intervention, the greater the likelihood of the child developing reinforced and inappropriate responses and behaviours. And we term this accommodation syndrome, when they accommodate actually the behaviours of the perpetrator and the groomer within their daily lives. It is also the right of children within the international rights of children that they should receive treatment as soon as possible. This causes issues for the criminal justice system, and the fourth bullet point on this slide mentions pre-trial therapy. And we offer children pre-trial therapy within the UK, plus also vulnerable adults who are going to be witnesses. and there needs to be no confusion about it. It is the child's right to receive therapy as soon as possible, and as long as therapeutic work is offered and counselling work is offered in a way that is according to a system and a procedure, there is no need to have any concerns about disrupting evidence for the criminal justice system. The Mary Collins Foundation has a sort of 4-hour half-day course on pretrial therapy, but the rights of the child, as always, should be respected, and this should be allowed. So with our working model, for disclosure, we need a culture that will hear children. And we know very few children in the past disclosed about sexual abuse before the days of the internet, but some children did disclose, or else they were able to be seen and observed by observant adults who were concerned about the behaviours. But what do we mean by a culture that will hear children? It doesn't just mean about hearing their voices. It means about looking and watching their behaviours, considering their mood swings, just having children in mind all the time and being aware of any change in their feelings, their behaviours, and their words and their actions. But of course now we use the term much more, and the term discovery is absolutely key, because what we do know is that whilst children before the internet found it difficult to disclose, there is almost a double whammy, as it were, when it comes to children who have been abused online and are very fearful to tell anyone about it. And we will go into some more detail on that when we look at the differential impacts of internet harm on children. But whether disclosure or discovery, whatever the way we are able to find out about a child who's been harmed, we do need a legal framework that will offer protection to the child. So we need to reflect nationally, all of us. We are in the UK always reviewing our legal frameworks, and as we learn more, we alter the framework in order to accommodate both the needs of the protection of children, but also the needs to ensure that perpetrators of abuse of children, online and offline, are able to come and be made responsible for their actions, and to be taken through the criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system that offers appropriate laws according to the developments of our understanding of abuse of children, particularly online. I'm just going to briefly bring you on to our multi-agency universal model for protecting and safeguarding children abused online, and the related offline abuse. Now, this model of training is called Click Path to Protection, and it is not about what to do, it is about how to do it. And the whole background to this model is that if, as I'm repeating from what a statement said earlier, if we actually approach children and their families in the right way, if we support them all the way along the journey from discovery of their abuse to the full recovery, we will get far better outcomes for everyone. And what we need to understand is that recovery begins at that very point of our initial professional intervention with the family. What we do and how we do it from that moment on will impact on outcomes of the case and the future well-being of the child and their family. We really need to understand the grooming process that occurs for children. This is a model that has been used for many years and is done by David Finkelor, who will be probably well known to you. And it has 4 stages. And to understand these stages will then help us understand the impacts on the children and what we need to be putting in place for their recovery. First of all, what someone needs to have is obviously the thoughts about wanting to have sex with the child. So the motivation for wanting to actually have sex with the child, engage with children in any sexual way. Now, we know through our years of experience and working in this field that far more people have a sexual interest in children than they would ever actually admit. We cannot be police. We cannot be thought police, as it were. We cannot police people's thoughts. But what we can do is hopefully help people not take that next further step, because the concern is some people take the next step and they decide they're going to go down the journey of, first of all, convincing themselves that actually it doesn't matter if they do it. David Finkelor calls this overcoming your internal inhibitors. We would probably call it overcoming your conscience, convincing yourself that it doesn't matter, you're not going to harm the child, or even if you are, you don't care about it, and you excuse yourself enough to move on to the fourth step. And the third step is about external inhibitors. So overcoming what is happening, what is around, and what are barriers for you within the community, and thus creating opportunities to get near a child. Now, this is offline. We're forgetting the online world at the moment. And so what perpetrators would do offline is that they would befriend children. They would get themselves into perhaps professions where they can have access to children. They could join community groups such as church groups, etc. So they can gradually make sure that they get into contact with children and have an ability to do that. So it's about creating an opportunity and actually often grooming environments or families in order to eventually have contact with the child victim. And David Finkelor calls this overcoming victim resistance. I would be more inclined to call it doing it and getting away with it. And if you do something that brings you satisfaction and you get away with it, you are more than likely to want to continue that activity. So this is the process online. And by the time it comes to overcoming the victim's resistance, victims don't have a chance really to have any resistance. And the grooming of the child is so impactful that they are silenced from telling generally, although some children do tell. Having looked at that grooming process and understood how that occurs, we need to think about what makes it difficult for children to tell. And there are many things that make it difficult for children to tell. And on this slide, you will see those. These relate to both offline and to online. But you will notice that I have put in darker ink the last bullet point about double silencing due to shame. And you need to remember this when it particularly comes to internet abuse. It's because of what children fear can be seen and also read about what they have talked about. But we'll go into a little more detail later on that. So what do children need in the aftermath of disclosure or discovery? They need to feel believed and supported. And I know there's some questions from colleagues in the Ukraine regarding the family members who perhaps aren't perpetrators and who are carers, etc. And probably the key person for the child to know that they are actually believed is the first person they may tell. And also one of the key people that children for their recovery need to have is if it's a family member who's abused them, but there are caring, supportive other family members who have huge importance for the child's security, those are the people who need to be supporting that child and believing the child. Because if a child feels believed, particularly by their principal attachment figure, they're almost a few, at least 40% on the way to recovery. But they also need to feel safe and thus be in a safe place. And they need to feel safe emotionally, but they also need to feel safe physically. And one of the key things is that they need to be protected from contact with the perpetrator, whether that is within the physical world or whether that is within the online world. At times in the past, people have continued to work with children in their recovery, knowing that they still may have contact with the abuser. And that is just not acceptable. You get double messages for the child, and the child may really be developing some of their understanding of their trauma, etc., but then go back 2 steps as soon as they have contact with the perpetrator. They need to be obviously offered recovery services and counselling and therapy as quickly as possible. But they also need further support. If we go back to that arrow that I showed you earlier on regarding the possibility that they may well need to be witnesses in court, and they need to receive proper preparation for that. Hopefully, with the internet and our greater understanding of the abuse of children online, we may, and also the gathering of evidence, we may be able to actually protect children from having to go to court. And I think we as professionals need to look at that and look at how we can collect evidence in order to prevent this happening and for children to have to go through the whole process of the court experience. What sort of things do we need to look at when we're helping children recover? Perceptions of safety are absolutely essential. What they perceive as safe or what might not be seen as safe by professionals would be another matter, and helping children understand that. Expressions and ventilation of feelings, all the impacts of the grooming process, their fears, their worries, etc., need to be addressed, acknowledged, owned, and help them and empower them to move on from that. They're often very muddled regarding sex education and sexual activities and what's acceptable and what isn't, and they need help with that. And probably one of the greatest problems is around guilt, trust, and ambivalence because they feel responsible for the abuse. But also, if you look at the other side of this slide, you will see in the darker ink the fact that we have a number of new issues when it comes to online. So safe online navigation and communication, they need to understand. Education about sexual offending, how it occurs, and how it is not their fault, and what the grooming process means. In particular, there are 4 areas that are brand new when it comes to internet abuse, and that is the impotence regarding disclosure, the shame, the responsibility felt, and the non-resolution of the abuse, which I will go into further later on in this presentation. As you will know, that with working with children, it is absolutely no good sitting down and trying to do a formal face-to-face therapeutic interview with children. That does not work out. Children need to have activities that they can use, and these masses of activities depending to age, understanding, and their interest. And it is while undergoing activities with children through the therapeutic sessions that one actually can get the conversation going, the talking going, and often they are going to tell us more through their drama, through their pictures, through their own writing, than they will through their actual words. When it comes to older children, they find it incredibly useful to, at some points during the recovery process, to hear about the experiences of others. And so when they get to a certain point in the therapeutic process, it is often really helpful for them to perhaps join a group of other young people who've been in similar situations, and they can share their experiences. Obviously, this sort of group would need to be managed appropriately. Also, what is incredibly useful for older children who perhaps are 12, 13, 14 onwards, is very useful, is for them to work on a timeline. And by that I mean, in order to get the conversation going, in order to be able to help them understand about what's happened to them, they often want to look back at their lifetime experiences from sort of birth onwards, and you can work along that timeline and look at significant events in their lives. Again, working on the sort of therapeutic interventions, as I mentioned, to go into detail, we would need a workshop, and a smaller workshop, an interactive workshop. So this is what I call a framework, but not as detailed as one would want to be able to do at this stage. Now, I know, as I mentioned before, the number of questions around the child's protective carer and whether children should be removed from the home if they've been sexually abused, or whether they should stay there. And my view and the practice within the UK would be, what is needed is a proper risk assessment regarding the protection of the child and the safeguarding needs. And we know that children need huge support, as I mentioned earlier, from their key attachment figures. And if the key attachment figures in their lives are deemed as being non-abusive and non-instrumental in any harm that's occurred to the child, it is absolutely essential that the children remain in the setting with those carers. But one has to remember that their carers also need support. If the abuse has been offline, and if it's perhaps been a partner or someone known to the non-offending carer, then they're going to need to come into terms with the fact that they were involved with a person of that nature, and often they need education about the modus operandi of offenders, the impact of sexual abuse on children, the impact of the modus operandi abuse on the carers and the family members. And then when we come to online, they need an understanding of ways in which they can safeguard their child online so that they are able to actually continue in their caring role and be the vigilant parent that they would actually want to be. But also some carers and parents, we need to be aware of the fact that they actually need personal support to the possibility of issues from their own past being re-stimulated through the abuse of their child. Again, that would be a day's program of explaining about how one does that, how one supports that. We are now going to look at a working model in the sense of what the process needs to be. So when running a therapeutic unit, which I did for 10 years, our process would be, we'd have a criteria for referral, and the criteria would be around the fact that the child needed to be in a safe place, needed to have supportive adults around them, and needed to be protected from the abuser. And we would have the relevant documents, and by that I mean it is no good starting to try and work therapeutically with the child unless you understand where the child's stage of development is. You might have a child of 11 who's actually functioning for whatever reasons around the age of 6. You may have a child of 11 who's actually extremely bright and perhaps functioning academically in other ways at a higher level. So you need to understand where the child is with their education, whether they have any special needs, both educationally and health-wise. And you need to know exactly, as far as possible, what has happened to the child. And so thus there needs to be good communication with police, as well as with education departments, and also social services departments and childcare departments, if they have done assessments. And then we would have a pre-planning meeting. And a pre-planning meeting is about actually inviting the child with their carer to come to the unit and to have a look around that unit, and for the child to make a decision whether they actually want to attend or not. So the child is not put on and told, the child is offered choices, and normally we would find that the child, having been to the unit, would be willing to come and to begin with recovery work. You then need to hold a planning meeting and to make arrangements, and also to ensure that the child is never let down at any time during the whole process of their recovery and treatment programs. After 3 months, we would hold an assessment meeting where identification of the key impacts that have happened for the child are put to the group, and you then are able to work on those issues with the child. And then you would have review meetings, and then you would have final review meetings. So there is a structure and a process, and one that the child understands all the way along the line. Reports for those meetings would be produced. The child would have an input into those reports and would know exactly what is being said and shared. And if of an age and an understanding, they would obviously be part of any meetings that are held about them and their recovery. Together with that process, you need to have what we call safe practice. So if you're running a therapeutic unit, you want to ensure that your staffing and recruitment processes are good, and that you are able to ensure through such practices that you employ people who are safe and have no records. So you need to do checks regarding all issues around that. Supervision is essential. And supervision takes actually three factors. First of all, there's the internal organizational supervision just of the case and the process of that. There's then what we call clinical supervision, which is around looking in further detail of that case with a clinical advisor. but also professionals in the field need their own personal supervision. And within the unit that I ran, you would ensure that all the therapists and counsellors were able to have external supervision every 6 months with an external person who was not attached to the unit but was able to support them in both the impacts on themselves of their work and enable them to be able to continue in a healthy manner to work with their children. Recording is absolutely essential as well, but recording needs to be done promptly, and it needs to be done in a way that is factual and to the point. You also may need to record for clinical supervision in further detail. And then, of course, quality control in the sense of checking that recording is being carried out and processes are being carried out needs to happen on an ad hoc basis. Okay, so now let's come on to online in a bit more detail. So what is different? These are the words of Tina, a young woman who we worked with about 10 years ago. And for her, she said, the internet is a weird version of the real world where you can do everything. Groomers don't have to worry about seeming suspicious. Children can act like adults. I use people online to make me feel good. Girls use groomers to make them feel mature. Groomers use girls for sex. It's mutual using of one another. Girls get involved with men because nothing much seems to be happening when you're 12 to 14, but you want to be older. And for her at that time, the most talkative girls online are the quietest offline, and the most normal man online is a real weirdo offline. We rarely talk about our behavior online. It's kind of embarrassing. And this was a real, actually eye-opener for me when working with this young woman, because she'd actually got it pretty right when I looked at what she was saying. And for her, that's exactly what the online world meant to her, and the way she's actually able to be an adult online, and yet she had this absolute confusion when she came offline, due to the fact that she's obviously still 12, 13-year-old when this abuse was occurring. The scale of the problem is still unknown, but what we know, you will know, what the whole world knows, is that it has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. And in fact, in the UK, our figures have grown exponentially over the last 3 years. 3 years ago, we were saying that we thought approximately 80,000 people had a sexual interest in children. This year, the figure has gone up to well above 300,000, we believe, have a sexual interest in children. So we don't know, but we know it's huge, and we know it has grown. And the key thing we know also when it comes to online is that children are doubly silenced regarding disclosure. So we're not going to hear it from them. We're going to have to find out in other ways how we're going to actually detect offending behavior and stop it in order to protect children. So quickly, what are the features of the new technology which facilitate the sexual abuse of children? They are here up on the screen, easily accessible, much quicker. The activity can be hidden. One of the key things is that it does disinhibit behaviors, both in adults and children, and the consequences of that. It acts as a quick conduit. It's a perfect conduit for those who wish to abuse children and set them up for prostitution, to traffic them and to abuse them online. In a way, such activities were never joined up in the past. So we do need to have some real joined up thinking about when we're interconnecting between internet crimes and the impacts on children. Another thing that we need to consider and bear in mind is what we would call the sexualization of children, and the impact of that on their behaviors and on particularly on their behaviors online. And we will look at that in a moment when I consider society's sexual exploitation of children. We then want to look at the next slide, which is around the abuse via the internet, mobile technologies, just how many platforms there are, how many ways there are of people being able to connect and interact with children. Now, in 2004, we carried out the first survey of professionals who are working with children who've been sexually abused and asked them if they were working with any children who've been sexually abused online and what the nature of the concerns were. These were the nature of the concerns that came out at that time. And as I say, it's the first study to be carried out in the UK, but also further afield. You'll see some of the terminology is different to that which we use today. And you need to remember that this report was actually carried out prior to Facebook, prior to any social media, etc. But nothing actually has changed since 2004 in the sense of these are still the same scenarios we are seeing, often interconnected, and our understanding about them has grown and what to deal with them and how to deal with them. So I'm going to move on to 5 key considerations that we need to actually bear in mind when it comes to abuse of children online. And the first 3 points on this slide explain how the impact of online abuse affects child victims. Looking at normalization, we're looking at discovery versus disclosure, and we're looking at grooming. Normalization, I think, is a word that's come into our vocabulary rather a lot, particularly just recently with the COVID crisis, the new normal. And so you'll be very familiar with this term. But for children, as we know now, use of sexualized language online is just normal. It is just a normal behavior. They see nothing strange in that. They see nothing strange in exchanging images, and often these images are not illegal, but often they are, and children do not understand the impact of that or what that means for them and both their safety, but also the legality of such situations. The other normality is the speed at which engagements happen online, the speed at which children befriend and one another, but also the speed at which grooming occurs online. And we're going to look at that again in just a bit more detail in a moment. And then, of course, children have a language of their own. Would you know what any of these mean? These abbreviations. These are everyday abbreviations that children are using when they're texting each other, but it's also abbreviations that offenders are also using, which they pick up in order to groom children online. Here's the translation. And what is key about these is that when you think about policing for a moment of online harm, our police officers have to try and make sense of these abbreviations in order to try and work out whether children are actually being groomed online or whether it's just normal communication between children. But if you saw things such as ASL, age, sex, location, one would be wondering what on earth is happening to this child and recognize the need for investigations. Age, sex, location, picture, again, concerns. Boyfriend, BF might mean nothing. Code 9, which is actually children trying to say parents around, could be of concern, it might not. But there's a huge implication for policing and how children communicate online, which is a way different from that of the adult world, but not from that of those wishing to harm children who key into how children communicate. So discovery versus disclosure. What we do know is children are not going to tell about online abuse, and we need to understand why they're not going to tell. Firstly, many young people might think that actually the person who's grooming them is not a groomer. They wouldn't even think of them as a groomer. They would think of them as a boyfriend, someone who's they're talking to and who's perfectly normal. So I wouldn't even think of reporting it. So you can imagine what that might feel like when actually the abuse is discovered and we professionals approach children who don't see an issue at all that's wrong in their lives. Many would feel complicit in the abuse because they feel they are seen as complicit through their behaviors and through their interactions. online with the perpetrator. And as we know, online, we are far less inhibited, and particularly young
Ні,
people.
синхронний переклад тобі не зроблю, це швидко дуже.
The other thing for young people is the shame of what they have been seen. They feel they have been seen doing these things, and therefore they would never want to be reporting that to anyone through that shame, which is quite understandable.
Вони ніколи не хочуть
They
репортити.
may be fearful of repercussions from the perpetrator, who may have threatened them and frightened them. But also, generally the abuse may well have been discovered by someone else rather than the disclosure which may have happened when the abuse was offline, which children may sometimes have disclosed. And so what the impact on the child is that suddenly they have decided to tell no one about what's happening for them online, and yet they are then approached about the matter. And it is absolutely natural that the child will either deny or give you minimum information, and a natural process for children for them to actually get to grips with the fact that someone has discovered this abuse, something that was so personal and maybe frightening, etc., but they did not want to talk about. This has implications again for how the criminal justice system sees this, because they will say, well, why didn't the child initially, as it were, and I put in quotes, confess to what had happened to them, to the professional who interviewed them. And so therefore there are questions about the integrity of the child's evidence, etc. But what is rarely understood is that disclosure is a process and it's not a one-off event. And just as discovery is a process and not a one-off event. And the need to understand that within the criminal justice system, so in order to make sure that those who are guilty of such abuse are not able to get off their offences because of the impact on the victim of not being able to tell their story all at one time, etc. Here's a young woman we work with called Jane, who said, I would never have told anyone if the police hadn't come knocking at our door. It turned out they had arrested the bloke I was friends with online and had traced me through examining his computer. First off, I said that I was terrified my mum and dad would know what I've been talking about. Don't even talk to your friends about what you say online. Somehow it seems a different world, one in which I can act like I'm 22 when I'm actually...
Взагалі, я чула про це, але ще на облік не ставили.
So most discovery and disclosure is about seeing the signs and asking the question. And both professionals, but also parents and carers have often said, what if I ask the question and I'm wrong? And I guess the message we need to give to everyone is, what if you don't ask the question? But what if you ask the question and you're right? So people are fearful about asking questions from children, and in this day and age, with the internet at the state that it is and the offending against children, we have to encourage just not only professionals, but also anyone around children, including parents, to have the knowledge base in which to ask questions, ask children about what is happening for them online. We worked with a young man for 8 years who was very badly abused online by a number of perpetrators, over 32. And his mother noticed changes in his behaviour, couldn't understand what was happening, had taken him to the GP, had gone to the school, had gone to a psychologist for advice and to a child psychiatrist. And no one asked the question of this child about what was happening for him online. And this mother said, if only I'd asked that question, I believe I would have saved him from all the abuse he suffered. But I didn't, and I will live with the guilt of not asking for the rest of my life. So we need to ask the question, and we need to not be afraid to ask the question. But this is one thing to really convey, particularly to those working with recovery needs of children, that we should never underestimate the impact of disclosure. But also never underestimate the impact of being informed that your abuse has been discovered when you chose not to share that at the time. I'm going to just return to the grooming process. And we're going to look at how very different it is online. I'm going to quickly take you back to this model again. And remember, you need to have a sexual interest in children. If you're going to be abusing children in the offline environment, and you need to convince yourself that it's okay to do it. And then you need to really work out how you're going to be able to get close to a child, which takes some manipulation, some planning, etc. And then you need to overcome the child's actual resistance. If we go back to this and look at stage 2, we have evidence now that very little conscience solving is involved for online perpetrators regarding approaching children. And we also know that because there are no external inhibitors to protect children online, that the perpetrator has no need to actually groom perhaps other people and other situations. They have direct contact with the child. So we can put a cross on internal inhibitors, we can put a cross on external inhibitors. And when it comes to overcoming the victim resistance, the children often don't realize they're being groomed. There's very little resistance to overcome. So in fact, the impact can be immediate. And we know that with groomers, there are two sorts. There are some who do continue to actually groom specific types of children, but we know that there are many, many offenders now who are just what we call scattergun until they can pick up a child who they know to be vulnerable. And very quickly the grooming process occurs. In fact, it hardly happens within the first session. The child can be clicked into and brought into the groomer's environment and mindset. And then the process happens. So the speed of engagement by perpetrators with child victims is so much quicker online. Types of grooming scenarios. I'm going to go back to the fact that I talked about societal grooming. In the last 10 to 15 years, we really have impacted on children and the way they see, I guess, sexual activities, sex education, themselves as sexual beings. And what we, I think, the whole adult community really across the globe have allowed them to have access to pornography in a way children would never have had in the past, through accessing it online. We need to only look at advertising, we need to look at music, films, media, modeling, etc. And children are almost encouraged to look at themselves as social and sexual beings, and to give them messages about expectations about how they should be. So we need to hold that children are in that environment now and have access to so much of that online. But then there are different grooming scenarios that we know occur. You've got the classic one, I'm the only one who understands you, telling a child online. You have the fear-inducing type, and you have the love and the romance type. We're going to give you just an example now with a video regarding the mother who I mentioned, whose child had been working with us for 8 years in order to recover. And this is the first man who actually groomed him online. And he was the last actual perpetrator that we caught. And this is the conversation that happened between him and the perpetrator. If we could have the next video, please, that would be lovely.
Зараз 1 хвилинку я вмикаю відео і прошу перекладачів також приєднатися до перекладу. Бачите відео?
I need to know before I see you. I don't know if I should tell you. Of course I do. Do you? Of course I do. Let me see you then. I don't really understand what it's like to be different. I don't understand what it's like to be different. No. Be a good little boy.
I think, would you please turn on your presentation?
Yes, just coming. I'll talk around that last video clip. Just checking we're at the right spot. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. The key aspect about that clip I've just shown you is, as I mentioned, this is the first person to have abused this child. And what is key for us to understand when it comes to recovery and is what was happening for this young man who at 13 had declared that he thought he might be gay online. He'd met this person who he thought really understood him, whom he had no idea he was a groomer, and was actually caught up emotionally with him to the extent that it took us about 2 years to help this young man understand that that person was not the person he thought he was. So the power of interaction online for young people who are seeking out to make sense of their own development is absolutely key to our understanding about what we might need to do to help children with their recovery. And if we go on to impacts, Mary Collins, who we named our foundation after, was sexually abused when she was 13 by a chaplain, a hospital chaplain, when she was in hospital and was poorly. And she always says, it's not so much what was done to me, but what it did to my head that matters. Meaning, physical things can happen and you can heal from that, but it is actually what it does to one's thinking and feeling about oneself and the outer world that really matters. And for her, the implications for assistance with recovery were actually crucial. And she received no help in recovery until she was actually age 40, when someone took her back to her childhood and said, what has been happening for you? And when they were able to discover what had occurred. We were going to play an audio on Mary, but we will not be doing that due to some problems with being able to put that online. But if anyone was an example of getting in there as early as possible to offer help and support, it is Mary Collins. As I say, from 13 to 40, age 40, she had no help. Her behaviours altered considerably. She was photographed illegally with images, and she absolutely hid that behind deep down in her subconscious and carried on living a life which was not a happy life. It was hugely eventful with psychiatric and psychological problems until she received help. Once she received help, as she says, the light came on and she's a completely different woman, and she has been an incredible person for actually bringing the issue of online harm and particularly abusive imagery and its impacts on children to the to the professional world and teaching us about those impacts. So if we just go back to these 4 new impacts, particularly because of due to online abuse of children. Impotence regarding disclosure. For children to feel that they had no control on who knew or who knows about what they've been doing online, what they've been saying online, what they've been sharing online, what they've been sending to other people online. One has to understand that feeling of impotence and how you have to be so careful about not destroying the young person's image of themselves, their control of their environment, their control of their emotional state. The shame, many talk about the shame and sort of, again, the double impact of the shame when it's online, because they know that people can actually trace and see what they've been writing, what they've been sharing in the written word, but also the imagery that they've been sharing. So if I were a 14-year-old and I've been sharing those imagery and I've been talking in the way that many young people normally, in inverted commas, talk online, then I know I wouldn't be wanting any adult to be seeing what I've been doing. So it's how you manage that and have a feel for that. Also, responsibility. They feel that they are seen as responsible, that they had agency within this abusive situation, and therefore they will be held responsible by all of us who are intervening. And at any time of intervention, from that first minute of discovering it and then approaching the child, you need to be absolutely clear with the child and with the parents about where the responsibility lies, and the responsibility lies, of course, with the offending person. Huge concerns about non-resolution of the abuse. If you've been the subject of abusive imagery and the images have not been removed, which most of them are not removed, and they're in circulation, the biggest fear is, how do you manage that for the rest of your life and how do you live with it? Excuse me. I think as professionals, we need to be very careful how we approach this matter. Of course, there is non-resolution in the sense of the images are out there. But we often talk about it in such a way as, my goodness, so there's no resolution whatsoever. And that is not true. And that's not true through my clinical experience and the experience of colleagues within the MCF. People can come to terms with the non-resolution of the abuse in the sense of the images still being out there, and they can go on to live good, fulfilling lives and not be defined by the fact that they are victim of abusive imagery. So while we talk about non-resolution, we must also always give hope, because we know people can recover and we know that they can go on, as I say, to live lives which are not determined by the fact that there are images of themselves out there. Again, within a workshop and an interactive workshop, we could go into far deeper ways of how one could manage, how one does that, how one works on, in fact, the self-esteem and the self-evaluation of the victim. Finally, on to resolution. So what works for recovery, particularly when it's children who are have been abused online? You saw in the earlier part of my presentation around the issues that we need to look at when children are being sexually abused, whether it's online or offline. I guess one of the key things that we've learned is you must contextualize therapeutic interventions within the young person's transitional stage of development. We have to remember that most young people we will be dealing with when it comes to online abuse are probably going to be aged between 9 and 15. You have to understand their stage of development. You have to understand about brain development. You have to understand about the fact that this is a really key stage where children would be testing out, where they would be questioning, all natural parts of their development through adolescence and into young adulthood. So understanding that, and therefore how to approach them in both manner, both wording, but both activities you might do with them is absolutely essential. Another thing is that we have to deal with quite often is understand the conflicting dynamic for the young person of being often like an adult online, but a child or young person offline. So many a time for those of us who have had the unfortunate necessity of either viewing abusive imagery in order to help with investigations or reading material that has been shared, you will see young people acting in a very sort of adult way, as it were, online, and yet they are actually having to continue acting as children, and they do act as children aged 14 offline. Huge conflict for their psychological development, which needs to be unpicked and worked on. You need to therefore give time and space. It doesn't happen overnight. And if I can refer back to something I mentioned earlier on, it is really helpful at some point for 13 to 14 to 15-year-olds that you're working with to actually be able to share some of their experiences with children who've been in a similar situation and have gone through the process of recovery. Also, sometimes it is very difficult, most of the time, in fact, for young people to actually talk about the experience that has happened, and it's quite unnecessary to ask them to do that in any recovery situation. There is no need for that, because we know what the impacts are of both sexual abuse offline and online, and we need to work on those impacts and to help bring those down and to help the young person to recover. So there is no need for detailed expectations of detailed information from the child about what's happened to them. That is not the role for recovery. The role for recovery is to work on what we know are the impacts and to lessen those for the child to be able to go forward and live a safe life. Also, it's so helpful to acknowledge to the young people about how they must be feeling and name what you think they must be feeling. You'll get nods from them, you'll get denials perhaps, but it's very difficult to actually expect them to be able to put into words what has happened to them. So we do often use examples, case examples, which we have videos of, and when it gets to a certain point in that recovery process, to show them a video and say, look, this is a story of one young person that we know. And when you do that, often at the end of that, you'll get almost a silence and almost a non-wishing to talk anymore on that issue during that session. That's quite normal. And often you'll find that when they come to the next session, I've many times found the young person look at me and say, you know, what you showed me last week, that was me, wasn't it? I see that was me. And I'll say, yes, it was. And it's so much easier often for them to have that sort of help rather than to actually expect them to talk in detail about what has occurred to them. Finally, outcome predictors. I think what we need to remember that every young person and child is different. And the degree of internalization of sexually abusive experiences, as we know, is unique to each child, and it's dependent on so many factors. So when children come to us for help and assistance, some children just need 2 or 3 sessions to make sense of what's happened to them in a certain area. They've got all the support from their family. They don't need support in any other areas of the impact, and they're able to go away. And as you know, some children might need 8 years because of the nature of the abuse. But so the key issues are, what was the abuse, and do we really understand it? So important, if we can, before we start working even with the children. The length of time that we believe that abuse may have occurred. We need to look at the circumstances in which it occurred. We need to understand the modus operandi of the abuser. So we need that knowledge in our heads before we start working with the children. Obviously, the perpetrator's relationship with the child victim will have an impact on how the child might be able to recover. The nature of the child's previous life experiences, have they been good? Have they got a bank, as it were, of good experiences, which gives them strength and beliefs in themselves, which again will help a quicker recovery. Degree of support and belief from the family, absolutely key. If the child's main carers believe the child, understand the child's a victim, or supporting the child, then we know that the child's recovery is going to be of a quicker nature and probably of a higher nature. And of course, don't forget that children have a natural inbuilt resilience, and some have higher resilience than others. But the key thing for all of us working with the recovery needs of children is year in, year out, when you ask children, and in fact adults often, you know, what has been the most important thing for you about the recovery sessions and the counselling sessions you've been receiving, they will say it is the nature of their relationship with their counsel. So key. You can have all the knowledge in the world, and we do need that knowledge to understand the impacts, etc. But what is so key is the nature of the relationship between you as the person trying to help the child recover and that child. I'm going to very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, but just want to dig down a little bit deeper regarding some specific areas of sexual harm to children. You remember I showed you the slide from Just One Click report, and there are 8 or 9 scenarios on that slide. And I'm just going to pick out 3 of them just to quickly show you how we then need to go, the questions that we need to be asking ourselves, and perhaps the areas in which you might want further working with us in partnership to look at these issues. So if we first do take children viewing adult pornography, and that was one of the first concerns expressed on that list from the Just One Click report. What we have to remember, we are so aware of the just ease of accessing this material, which was never ever possible before the internet for young people. And we know many, many thousands and thousands of young people are accessing adult pornography. We know that probably most 13-year-olds will probably put their hand up if they were asked, have you been on adult pornography? Of course they're going to go onto adult pornography sites. They're going to be fascinated about sex, etc., etc. Quite a normal interest at that age and the stage of their development. But one has to think about what the impact of that is and what messages it gives, both to their view of themselves and their relationships. And we know that it is not only just boys, but it is also girls who are increasingly looking at adult pornography. And we need to think of the impact on the girls as well. So for girls, we know that it impacts on the expectations of their body image, the impact of what they're actually available from view, and what they're meant to be making sense of with that. We know that they're starting viewing at a younger and younger age. Probably the youngest we now know about is about 9 years old. We know from some of our major clinics in the UK that the growth in referrals purely due to problematic internet use by teenagers, particularly in regard to looking at adult pornography sites, has increased considerably over the years. And we find that the clinical problems presented by young men are intimacy deficits, ability to show empathy, unrealistic sexual expectations of their partner, and as I say, inability to show empathy during sex and perhaps before and afterwards, and you've got relationships breakdown. So we have to be really concerned about how we can educate young people regarding formation of sexual intimacy and relationships in the real world, as it were, which do not necessarily coincide in any form, or most forms, when it comes to actually looking at adult pornography. But there's also another issue regarding young people looking at adult pornography, and a number of cases we've been involved in when actually it is the beginning of a spiral. And it is, some young people have actually been groomed and encouraged by their groomer to then look at adult pornography, and they give them the permissions to look at it and to become involved in activities that they're seeing online. Often it's a desensitization either by adults living in the same home who are leading children down that path, or adults who are grooming them from outside the home with a wish to eventually abuse the children. And often it is about feeding the groomers fantasies and showing the child the demonstration of the groomer's preferred sexual activity in order to eventually offend against the child themselves. So when children, we know, are looking at adult pornography in a way that is of concern anyway, but in a way that is fixated, etc., we need to look at what is the causation of that, what was the initial contact with adult pornography, how did they get into that world? Quickly, we'll go on to children of adults who download child abuse images. This is absolutely key at this current moment in time. There's different practices and different approaches to this issue. We first came across in Operation All, which was in the early 2000s. And that was a huge operation which was actually carried out in the United States when a couple had opened up a site which was for membership only, and they had massive abusive images of children which people were able to access. And 60 countries in the end were involved, and UK being one of them. And I think we had over 6,000 people who were actually members on that site. But we learned a lot from that, that investigation, which, as I say, was probably at least 15, 16 years ago. And with questions we needed to ask ourselves, and we still need to ask ourselves when we're assessing risk in this situation is, you know, what risks do the adults, does the adult who's actually viewing the abusive imagery pose to children in the home? What are the impacts on the family dynamics? And we still have little research or practice guidance on this, which is much needed. But I guess some of the things we need to talk about is the relationship. What is our understanding of the relationship between viewing and between doing? And that is, how much of a risk is someone who views these images on children either within the household or in the broader context? The other question is, should the carer who is viewing these images be removed, or should the child be removed from the family home? And obviously we will be saying in the UK, and I think generally across the world, hopefully, that no child should be removed from the family home if they have a carer there who is non-abusive. And often the female carer has no idea whatsoever what her partner was doing and what he was up to, as it were. So if we go on to just a little bit further on this about the relationship between viewing and the commission of further sex offences against children. At the moment, much of what we know relates to police operations or case studies and unpublished anecdotal material. The actual data that we have in the research, even up to this current day, is problematic, because we see in the different forms of research that different populations are considered, such as those in prison versus those being assessed in the community, the time frames for the data over the years, the ways in which the data is collected, some it's telephone interviews, some self-reports, some reconviction rates. We have a huge lack of longitudinal studies, although there are some being developed just recently, which will hopefully help us make decisions about future activities in this field. And don't forget, new technologies move on from when we were first involved with this to now, with our mobile internet, etc. We will yet have differing scenarios regarding people who perpetrate abuse in this way. But I guess one of the key things of the Mary Collins Foundation with other major NGOs in the UK is what we call the secondary victimisation. And that is, you have a person, generally it is male, in the family home who's been viewing indecent images of children. That person will generally in the UK be asked to move out of the family home while investigations occur in order to protect the children and the non-abusing partner, which is normally the mother within that family home. But we feel that the secondary traumatization that both the partners and the children and sometimes the wider family feel has not been addressed, and they are often left in absolute disarray, absolute shock, and expected to just cope with what has happened to them. Very little explanations are given to them regarding to the partner, the non-abusing partner, about what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. They are trying to come to terms with something they've just discovered about their partner, which they never knew about, which to them is shocking. They have explanations to give to the school, they have explanations to give to their friends, and how they're going to do that and how they're going to manage that. And how do they protect their children from both the stigma of what's occurred within the family, but also to the fact that perhaps this person who's been removed, their father, who in many ways was probably a loving, caring man, has suddenly been taken out of their life and away from them, and so they lack his support and love and caring. There's a huge gap here, and we are currently forming within the UK a particular study group, a working group with government departments to look how we properly protect and nurture those who are the secondary victims of partners who view abusive images of children. An interesting piece of work which we'll be very interested in sharing with colleagues in the Ukraine and further afield. And again, that would be a half day or a whole day's actual workshop to look at the whole way we as professionals manage those sorts of situations in order to ensure that those who have been viewing our abusive images are dealt with in a proper and appropriate legal manner, but those who are the victims, the secondary victims of it, are supported and helped to continue a life that has meaning and is without too much stress. Very quickly, as again, this is a starter for 10. Again, this working with young people sexually harmful behaviour is a huge subject matter, but just some questions that we need to be asking ourselves around this. And the first question is what are we, how are we noting this behaviour? Are we saying it's concerning behaviour, or are we saying, is this child just experimenting? Is it both? How do we determine that? We know that young people will place themselves and others at risk. Perfectly normal to be risk-taking in your teenage years. It's about how you help young people manage those risks. What we have to be so careful of is not to criminalise children. There are real problems with labelling their behaviour, and there's a huge lack of understanding of the developmental issues that I have mentioned previously around the age group of sort of 10 up to 14, 15. And we know that they have huge different issues from adults would about what love and control look like, feel like, sound like. And we know, as I've said, that there needs to find out, to experiment, to push, by far supersede rules for young people. So motivations for their behaviours, which may seem illegal, would be very different from motivations probably of behaviours of those who are adults. And children do not need to be treated as many adults. They are children, and teenagers are teenagers, and they need to be treated within an understanding of their developmental stage. We know various examples of harmful behaviours, such as downloading abusive images of children, placing images online, social soliciting, sexting, bullying, etc. Sorts of questions one might be wanting to ask. How would we discover this behaviour? In what context is it occurring? What motivated the child to look at the abusive images? Was this planned, or was it a calculated activity? How long has it been going on? Was this sole activity, or were others involved? What did the carers know about this child's activity? Are there child protection issues for the child and family in the family? What is the nature of the abusive images? And most importantly, is this a criminal justice issue? Is it a child protection issue? Or is it both? What obviously need is thorough assessment and intervention programs, and the huge discussion that can occur with these particular issues, which is around, is this about protection or is this about conviction? And I think you'll find in the majority of cases, we need to be treating this as a safeguarding matter unless we have enough evidence to say that this person's behaviours were sufficiently dangerous, that we need to also take a legal position as well. The current practice models are very rare and almost non-existent. We are still ill thought out about how we approach children who officially are engaged in illegal behaviour, but are probably engaged in behaviours which are experimental as opposed to motivated by other issues. Just going to give you a case, final slide, a case example of this. In 2002, I was approached by our youth justice team, and they said they had a 13-year-old boy that needed some help because he'd been caught actually downloading abusive imagery of children. And when the police actually investigated the case, he was downloading abusive images of babies aged 6 months who were being sexually abused and interfered with, and that was his masturbatory fantasy. He came to our unit. He was taken to court, and the police had come to us and the youth justice team just after the child had been to court, and he had pleaded guilty, and he was given a community order and order to attend the clinical unit that we were running. And he came, and we did a full assessment, and we could find no contraindicators within his family, within his schooling, within his social life, within his own personality that would cause us to in any way understand how he had actually been looking at these images and how the sexual fantasy developed. So we therefore eventually found and traced the police force that had actually been engaged in the Sting initiative that had caught this young man, and we went over and spoke to them at length. And they were able to show us that in fact this young man had been groomed online. He had first been put onto sites of children, young people of his own age, and encouraged to masturbate to those images. And as time went on, the groomer introduced him to younger and younger children until we had the scenario where his masturbatory fantasy was, as I say, 6-month-old children being grossly abused. What we discovered then, and talking to the police, my comment to the chief police officer involved in that investigation was, what do you think the next stage was? And he said, just looking at it, all we've got, I reckon that child, he said, was going to pick, or that young man was going to be picked up at any moment because of the stage of the sexual grooming, etc. And so what we had, in fact, was a young man who had no contraindicators whatsoever. He was a popular boy in his school. He was a good footballer, key member of the football club. His parents were absolutely straight down the line people, no other issues within the family. And this young man had been groomed online, controlled and groomed online, and was then, having been to court, a Schedule I offender. His whole future life and hopes, because he had been wanting to go into education, was going to be impacted. And his behaviour was criminalised, rather than, before taking the matter to court, a discussion being held as to more investigation into this case before decisions were made about whether this should have gone down the safeguarding system, as it were, or the criminal justice system. If that had happened, this young person would not have a police record now, because it would have been recognised actually that he was more victim than perpetrator. So we have a huge concern in other areas around this as well, around how children are criminalised, and we have concerns about the criminalisation of childhood due to internet activity. And it is something that we will be looking at, hopefully with colleagues both throughout the UK, but also abroad in the future. That is an absolute overview of many of the issues that we need to be looking at when it comes to recovery of needs of children. We will be developing, and in the process of developing, programs around a number of these issues and a number of ways in which children can be sexually harmed online, to help with their recovery, which we would be more than willing, obviously, to discuss with colleagues in the Ukraine, etc., as the months go on. But now, so that's the end for me. More than willing to answer questions, but just to let you know, and as you mentioned, Anastasia, we have our 6th international conference. For the first time, this will be online. They've always been held at the BT Centre in London in the past, but due to our COVID situation, they will be all online, and you have the details there. and also to let you know about the fact that we have great pleasure in announcing that our Global Protection Online Network, which we have been working on for a number of years, it came into its initial stages about 4 or 5 years ago in our thinking about what was needed, so all of us internationally can share our experiences and our concerns and ask for help and assistance with issues we're working with when it's online abuse of children. And this will be launched in October, and details of how the whole network will work and the how the portal will work will also be part of our international conference presentations. So thank you very much. As I say, this has been what I call an overarching presentation of the issues we need to look at, with the acknowledgement that for those of you who are working on day-to-day on the actual recovery needs of children, we would be very happy to actually go into more detailed, smaller workshops and be able to talk through the issues and interact and exchange with one another on those points. So thank you so much for listening.
Дуже дякую вам, Тінг, за дуже надихаючу презентацію. Насправді, я не перший рік вже працюю в цій темі, але ж завжди під час співпраці і комунікації з вами я дізнаюся дуже багато нових речей. І сподіваюся, що для наших колег сьогодні також було багато нової корисної інформації, яку вони можуть використовувати в своїй роботі. Я б запропонувала нам зараз зробити коротеньке опитування, і після цього в нас буде 10 хвилин на запитання. Шановні учасники, якщо у вас є запитання, пишіть їх, будь ласка, в чаті. Також у нас є запитання, які ми отримали від вас під час реєстрації. А зараз прошу вивести на екран наше перше запитання. Воно буде стосуватися того, що необхідно оцінити рівень ваших знань заданої теми, особливості та процедури надання послуг для дітей та їх сімей, які постраждали від насильства в інтернеті, до участі у цьому круглому столі. Тобто, як ви оцінюєте ваш рівень знань до відвідання цього заходу. Саме з теми послуги для дітей, які постраждали в інтернеті від сексуального насильства. Зараз чекаємо лише 8-10%, почекаємо хоча б половина учасників, щоб відповіли. 21, 22. Давайте, щоб у нас більше було часу на запитання. Тобто 1 – це мінімальний рівень, 5 – це максимальний рівень. Так, бачимо 40%, можливо, це максимальний же, хто в нас буде приймати участь. Бачимо, середня оцінка в нас 3. Окей, прошу зупинити опитування. І ми переходимо до другого запитання. Суть запитання така ж сама, але ж як ви зараз оцінюєте ваш рівень знань з теми соціальні послуги для дітей та сімей, які постраждали від сексуального насильства в інтернеті? І прошу відкрити наше друге запитання. Тобто ми бачили, що до відвідання цього заходу рівень був середній, тобто на 3. І як ви зараз оцінюєте ваші знання з цієї теми? Чекаємо ще півхвилинки, щоб в нас приблизно така ж кількість респондентів була. На одному з заходів у нас були дуже цікаві показники. На початку заходу люди вважали рівень знань на 4, а після заходу оцінили на 3. І це нам каже про те, що інколи нам здається, що ми дуже гарно знаємо якусь тему, але ж коли починаємо в неї занурюватися, ми розуміємо, що там просто цілий океан знань ще й інформації. І бачимо 4 в нас після відвідання заходу. Дуже вам дякую за відповіді і зараз пропоную переходити до наших тоді запитань. Тінг буде озвучувати запитання українською мовою, щоб всі учасники також могли ці запитання чути. Було питання до терміну «досудова терапія». Які інструменти застосовуються? Як здійснювати цю досудову терапію, щоб в ході допиту дитина змогла легалізувати спогади в процесі досудового розслідування? Можу ще раз повторити. Питання до терміну «досудова терапія». Які інструменти застосовувати? Як здійснити досудову терапію, щоб в ході допиту дитина змогла легалізувати спогади в процесі досудового розслідування?
Yes, absolutely. I'll give you the background to this. When I went to run my first therapeutic unit, after 2 weeks, I looked at the list of children who were on the waiting list to attend the unit, and I noticed that some children who had been referred at a later date were already getting a service, when children who had been referred before them were not. And so I asked the team of therapists and counsellors in that unit, why was this the case? And they said it's because the children who have been waiting longer, it is because they are going to give evidence in court. So we cannot work therapeutic with them until they've done that. My immediate response was, this cannot be right. This cannot be in the best interests of children, nor in the best interests of justice. Mm-hmm. And so what I did was I said that we must contact our judiciary, we must contact our Crown Prosecution Service, and we must look at this because this is not in the best interests of children. And so what we did was to educate the police, the judiciary, and the CPS about how the therapeutic process occurs. They were absolutely had a misunderstanding about how you work with children in recovery. The last thing you need to do when working with children in recovery, we had to teach them, was to ask them to go into every detail about their abusive experiences, what had happened to them, and to tell us all about it. We know that that is totally unessential, and it is not something you would do as any therapist. That information has been given to the police. That is where that remains. If children choose to speak about that and choose to want to actually verbalize what has happened to them with their therapist, that's fine. Inevitably, most of the time you find that is not what they want. What they want is to feel better about themselves, to gain their confidence, to be able to look people in the eye and feel brave again, to feel happy, etc., etc. And those are the actual principal areas of work you need to work on. And so we explained this, we actually went through our whole process of working. We also went through that structure that I gave in one of the slides, which is around having your process absolutely tightly in place. How you're going to, the conditions under which you accept a referral, the information you need to be given. So for example, the information you need to be given from the police is you do need to understand what's happened to that child. Because when you are working with children therapeutically, they are inevitably probably going to give you some more information or new information, because as I said, disclosure is a process. Even discovery is a process. Disclosure is not a one-off event. So whatever information the police may have had from interviewing children regarding the abuse they've experienced, they won't have the whole picture. And that is perfectly normal. Anyone who suffered trauma, you do not tell your whole story at once. So with the understanding that, of course, within the therapeutic setting, we may well get a more disclosure or further information around the abuse, we had to draw up a protocol. So they agreed that we should work with the children under a certain protocol. Once they understood how we worked, how we would never be asking direct questions of children of their abusive experience, etc., etc. And we drew up a protocol which was that before we started the actual work with the child, we would just check with the police that there's no further investigations into this particular matter, and that we were free to actually start working with the child, i.e. they weren't going to need to interview the child again for any reason. We would keep a record of the date and the time that we saw the child and who was present in the room, if anyone. And we also had an agreement that obviously if we, as with any situation, if we received new information which is about harm to a child or an adult, the children knew from the beginning of working with us that we would need to report that. If it's a harm against themselves, another child, or a vulnerable adult. And we had a process with which we did that, a format, a proper formula, a form we filled out, which is what the child had told us, when, why, and how, and that would be reported immediately to the police if that was necessary. I got that protocol fixed up, and it's a little bit of a long story, but I'll be as quick as I can because it's really important. I came back to my team and I said, right, we've got the agreement at long last. It's taken me about 6 months of the whole, the criminal justice system, as it were, in our area to agree that we pilot this. And then they said to me, we're not going to do it. And I said, why not? And they said, because we are so fearful about the confidentiality of our records and our relationship with our children that we work with. And so I said, I will go and get a barrister, a top QC legal person to give me advice on that, which I was given. And the advice was that as long as we report, should there be any new information that could have an impact on the safety of an individual, then we should resist if we were asked for our records by the criminal justice system. And then if they were still demanded, we would then apply for what we call public interest immunity, and then send our papers, obviously, to the judge of the hearing to be able to decide whether he would allow our documents to be, the confidential records to be open to the defense barristers as well as the prosecuting barristers. On that accord, and with that protocol drawn up as well, we went ahead and did pre-trial therapy. We did it for 5 years. We wrote up on the outcome. This is from 95 to 2000, so we're looking at 25 years ago when we started this. And from the outcomes and the assessment of the success of that program, we were actually, the government launched pre-trial therapy guidance in 2001 in the UK. And what it involves is just knowing what you're doing, basically. No proper therapist would ever lead children to talk about their abusive experiences unless they wanted to, as long as you know what to do if you get new information. And you need to get, obviously, the agreement of the whole system. Now, having said all that, the other thing is your recording needs to be accurate, to the point, and you need to be careful about not putting any insinuations or interpretations within your notes, etc. On just going back to the pilot, which we did for the 5 years, during that period, I'm more than happy to send this over to Anastasia and to colleagues. I think on 3 occasions, if I remember correctly, our papers were asked for. On 3 occasions, I refused to give them and applied for public interest immunity. I took the file and the papers to the court. I addressed the judge on the matter. And on all 3 occasions, the judge absolutely upheld our viewpoint and no papers were disclosed. So the fears around professionals of the police that we were going to be putting words into children's mouths were absolutely shown not to be true, and that's not the way we would work. The fears of the therapists that their confidential records would be taken and their children they've been working with be betrayed proved to be absolutely something that they did not need to worry about, because the judges had been absolutely responsible in their application of our requests. So around pretrial therapy, often it's about what I call the myths that abound, about A, what you do when you're working with children in recovery, but B, the belief that also the courts will take over and we can't keep confidentiality when we were able to. But we have a whole presentation on that, which would take half a day. Again, more than happy to. In fact, I think it would be quite useful, Anastasia, if we do a list of the different programs, and then we can share. And hopefully very soon, within the next few months, we're not going to do it this way, but we're going to be together, all of us, and we can actually do it face to face. And I know that my colleague, Victoria Green is listening into here, and I know she'll be noting all the different things that we are wanting to produce and the information we have. So, but I'm more than happy to forward straight away the research document on that and the proof of the evidence immediately, so you can give it to everyone who's attending.
Дуже вам дякую, Тінг, за детальну відповідь. Я впевнена, що це у вас є окремий семінар на цю тему. І я сподіваюся, що ковід скоро мине, і в нас буде можливість все ж таки всім зустрітися в офлайні і мати такі одно чи декілька денні тренінги на окремі теми. Ми з радістю поділимося матеріалами, які ви надішлете. Також учасникам вишлемо презентацію з вашого дозволу і інформацію щодо конференції. У нас, на жаль, вже закінчився час. У нас є ще деякі питання, але ж я думаю, що ми їх залишимо вже для окремої зустрічі. Будемо раді, якщо буде бажання зробити згодом ще додаткову зустріч, бо питань багато. На сьогодні я хотіла б вам дуже подякувати за дуже цікаву і корисну інформацію. Мене насправді завжди надихає досвід Великої Британії і те, наскільки далеко ви вже просунулися в питаннях захисту дітей і в офлайні, і в онлайн-середовищі. Мені здається, що Велика Британія є таким маячковим прикладом для всього світу спільно з Австралією щодо питань захисту дітей в інтернеті. Тому я вам хочу сьогодні подякувати за те, що ви поділилися вашим досвідом і за те, що ви робите цю роботу для захисту дітей в Британії і також по всьому світу. І хочу вам надати можливість останнього слова, такого надихаючого для України. Ми знаходимося на самому початку цього шляху по захисту дітей в онлайні, тому ваші надихаючі слова будуть для нас дуже-дуже цінними.
Absolute pleasure. Anastasia, ever since I met you, I just thought you were so inspiring yourself. You are doing so much within your country, and I know you do it with colleagues, and the MCF are hopefully inspiring all of us within the UK, but also further afield. But what we realise more than anything is this is an international issue. If you press, as I often say, if you have an offender has an abusive image and he presses the button, as it were, in Basingstoke in England, that image gets out to Bangkok, or in that, and we know that we cannot but work collaboratively, internationally, globally, and we all have things to learn from one another. Yes, in many ways, perhaps the MCF is quite a step ahead, partly because that is just our absolute speciality, and because I have been involved in the field so long, just as my colleagues within the organisation have been. But the key thing that we are recognising, and now on our Global Protection Online Network platform is going to actually sort of represent this, is there's two different ways of growing. And both are important, and you need to do them. And my experience in the UK is this, if I think over the 47 years I've been working in the field, is yes, you need to actually get what I call overarching governmental change, which is it'll be around laws, it'll be around procedures, it'll be around practice guidance, etc., etc. To get those overarching changes and to ensure that the safeguarding legalities are in place, you have to keep working at that, because it changes. Our whole understanding changes, and with the internet coming on board, my goodness, has it changed, and have we had to do a lot of high-level influencing in order to get change in our legal systems and in our protection systems, etc. But also what we do know is that from the base level, from the core bit, from that little NGO who says that is not good enough, that needs to change, that is where you can really impact on practice. And it's generally the NGOs who are able to be flexible enough to push into bits of society, bits of our approaches, and influence them, which eventually then end up moving to, as I call, the overarching influence of government policy and practice. And I guess the key thing is, and the difficulty as countries develop, and as countries perhaps not quite as far ahead as perhaps we are here, is that it's so important to have the right legal system in place, both when it comes to criminal justice, but also to safeguarding children, in order to be able to carry out that recovery work and make sure they're safe together. And I think the most important thing is that working in partnership, we would want to see as one of our priorities with our Ukraine colleagues. There's nothing like a trusting relationship, and the trusting relationship is built up. There is a general approach that is similar to ours, and that is that we want the best for our children, more than anything, because our children are our future, and we know that. And so if we don't do good for our children, then we're not going to be doing good for anybody else at all. So we just look forward to working in partnership with you, both at what I call the macro level, the overarching level, but also the micro level, where little changes can have huge impacts for the benefit of children. And I know my team, many are involved just watching this today, will be nodding their heads as I say that. And we cannot thank you enough for allowing this introduction really to you and many of your colleagues, and so look forward to working with you in the future.
Дуже вам дякую, Тінк. Ми отримали багато відгуків в чаті від учасників, які дуже-дуже дякують за вашу презентацію, ваші виступи, вашу роботу. Також отримали багато запитань щодо надсилання відео і презентації, також матеріалів, про які ви згадували. Тому всі учасники, які проходили реєстрацію, заповнювали форму, ви вже найближчим часом отримаєте презентацію. Якщо раптом хтось з вас реєстрацію не проходив, дуже просимо вас заповнити форму, яка зараз знаходиться в чаті, щоб ми могли вам надсилати матеріали і надіслати відео цього вебінару. Тінк, дуже вам дякую, вам і всій вашій команді, і сподіваюся, що вже зовсім скоро ми побачимося з вами в офлайні, і бажаю вам надихаючої і успішної конференції вже восени.
Thank you, Anastasia. And just one point, can I just ask on a practical level, can you collate the questions that haven't been answered? I'd be really interested to look at them, because that will inform us about the knowledge that people might be requiring and how we could develop good packages. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, and it's been a delight to be with you today.
Дуже дякую вам тоді і до нових зустрічей.